My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host. Our guests are Michael Marcello and Michael Salzillo. Gentlemen, welcome to State of the State.
Good to be here.
Good to be here.
Mr. Marcello is a former Democratic state representative from District 41, representing Scituate and Cranston, and a former councilman from Scituate. He now practices law in Providence, specializing in municipal law. Mr. Salzillo is a senior at Providence College and writes a political blog. Both of you are supporters of Question 1, which is this year's ballot, on this year's ballot, which is a referendum regarding a state constitutional convention. Rhode Island's Constitution requires that voters be asked every 10 years if they would like to convene a constitutional convention. A constitutional convention is where elected delegates convene to review the Rhode Island Constitution and propose amendments for voter approval. The convention would involve electing 75 delegates from each of the House districts, and the current General Assembly members would not be eligible. Opponents, including the State Democratic Party and the ACLU, raise concerns about revising our governing document in a politically charged environment, the risk of well-funded special interest groups having undue influence, the possibility of losing or rolling back civil protections, and the cost of organizing a convention. Proponents argue that a constitutional convention is a fundamental democratic process, offering a rare opportunity to reform government operations and move forward with initiatives that have stalled in the legislature. Suggested topics for the convention would include establishing a statewide inspector general, ensuring a right to education, line item veto for the governor, instituting term limits, and reversing the Rhode Island statutory ban on large capacity magazines for firearms. Gentlemen, you both support a con-con, and I'm going to use that word for brevity in referring to, rather than saying constitutional convention all the time, but you both support it, so let's look at some of the issues first that the opponents have raised. Powerful special interest groups have deep pockets and significant influence over elections. These groups use their financial resources to fund campaigns, run advertisements, and lobby lawmakers. And this kind of influence can drown out the voices of regular voters and, let's face it, ordinary citizens. How do you respond? First, Mr. Marcello, how would you respond to that?
I think that's true, but I think it's a misnomer that those same special interests are not there influencing the General Assembly today. So those same interests that would be lobbying for or against certain constitutional provisions, they're there in the General Assembly today, whether it be labor, business, whatever. There are special interests in our politics. We're not going to get rid of that. I don't think it's something to be afraid of. The system is designed for special interests to have competing values, and it's up to the voters or the legislature to figure that out. As far as pouring money into it, we have a very, very good campaign finance law in Rhode Island, which would require any of these special interests to disclose if they spend more than $1,000 for or against any proposition, whether it's a con-con or specific amendments. So there would be a disclosure mechanism, so we would know where that money is coming from. But to suggest that somehow the con-con would be subject to special interest where the General Assembly is not is just not true. The special interest everywhere. That's the way the system is designed. But I think the check is that the voters have the final say. And when the voters have the final say, they're going to go into the ballot booth and they're going to vote yes or no on some of these amendments if it does pass. And that's the ultimate check, is that the voters, everyday citizens will have the right to either approve or reject these amendments if they're proposed.
Mr. Salzillo, would you like to add to that?
Absolutely, and let me just say I appreciate State of the State taking the time to discuss this issue and have a fair and honest and open discussion about the con-con, as we can say it in short. I mean, look, there's valid concerns and valid arguments that you can make on both cases. In regards to the special interest component, because, look, we live in an era with Citizens United where campaign finance laws and where campaign finance it's very different from what it was 3 decades ago, the last time we had a con-con in 1986. And I think it's been, if I'm correct, 30 years or so since there's been a constitutional convention anywhere in the United States. I could be wrong, so if anyone needs
Rhode Island is the last one anywhere in the country.
Right. So in regards to the special interest component, I mean, there are valid issues that you always have to look at and be cautious about and be aware of. Healthy skepticism is a healthy part of the process. As for whether special interest could exclusively hijack a constitutional convention, con, I'm actually tempted to think that you can have a very open process that comes from this. And Marcello makes a great point about how there are campaign finance laws where you have to disclose a certain amount of money that's made, that's contributed to a particular cause one way or another. But even beyond that, I mean, even today we got the state house politics where you have a few individuals, few lobbyists. We could even think of Bill Murphy, who is working with payday lending groups. And these are people who regularly take advantage of the state house system.
Mm-hmm. Now, the ACLU argues that a con will try to enshrine in an amended constitution such things as LGBTQ plus rights, rights for immigrants who are here illegally, reproductive rights for women, workers' rights, voting rights, and eliminate the Second Amendment. Mr. Salzillo, do you want to respond to any of those?
Welcome to respond to I'm happy to make a few examples of some of those cases too. The idea that, let's say, to give a few issues, abortion is the most notable one, especially in the midst of the Dobbs ruling. And I like to take an issue from the past, which is Rhode Island having a similar issue come up in 1986, where there was abortion restrictions up. And it was rejected by a 2-to-1 margin. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably the most important thing we could emphasize about the con process. Whatever comes out of the delegates of the convention, with all the delegates that are there, same number as in the state House of Representatives and the state Senate, whatever the case is, voters still have to approve that. Voters statewide still have to approve that. And in that case, where they didn't approve abortion restrictions in 1986, mm-hmm. important to emphasize that, we're now, I'm trying to think, 30, maybe even 40 years into the process now, where we have states across the country, Montana, Kentucky, approving, I don't want to say approving, but they're protecting the right to an abortion. So in the context that you might have special interests overriding the will of the people, there are indications nationally that hasn't happened. So that's one issue. Another one is labor rights. There's a talk about unions and the union opposition to con. And I could also mention a little bit about how I actually believe con can help labor causes and in a nonpartisan way. But to take an example of right to work, in Missouri there was a right to work law. Voters put it on the ballot and they repealed it. So I think the idea that you might have a process where public opinion is overturned is something that, I'm not saying that it can't happen, but I just don't see it happening considering the Rhode Island electorate, the nature of it.
Okay. There are two ways to amend our state constitution. The General Assembly can put a question on the ballot for the voters to approve, such as Separation of Powers Amendment approved in 2004, which removed legislators from commissions like the Coastal Resource Management Council, and the 2006 amendment restoring voting rights to those on parole or probation. You're a former state rep, Mr. Marcello. Isn't this a better way to amend our Constitution on a case-by-case basis where it's debated and there's testimony before a legislature?
I'm not so sure it's a better way. It's an alternative way. And having served in the legislature, I can tell you that getting constitutional amendments through in the legislature is a very hard process as well. When I was there, one of the things that I pushed was to reversing a Supreme Court decision, Rhode Island Supreme Court decision that basically removed Ethics Committee oversight over members of the General Assembly because they made that ruling based upon their interpretation of the Constitution at the time, based upon an amendment that was adopted in 1986. We had to work really hard. It took like 4, 6, maybe 6 years to actually get that onto the ballot. To basically reverse it and then make sure that General Assembly members were subject to the Ethics Commission oversight. So it's not a better process, it is a different process. But again, when you're in the legislature, you're dealing with legislation, normal bills every day, and then you're dealing with constitutional. There's just not a lot of time there where a group voted for by the population to focus on constitutional issues. And I think it's important to recognize that the Constitution not only guarantees rights, but it also has the structure of government. So there are really two lanes that we can, two lanes that a con could go to, or both. But we look at the current structure of government. Is it working? Is it serving the needs of the people today? It hasn't been amended in 40 years, since 1986. And then we can look at the rights and responsibilities, like abortion rights, like gay rights. I think that I agree with the guest here, is that Rhode Island today is far different from the 1986 populace that was there back when these things were approved. And I would venture to think that voters would approve a constitutional amendment that would protect a woman's right to choose.
We already have that legislation.
But putting in the Constitution would make it permanent until it's changed again by the Constitution.
Or by the Supreme Court.
Or by the Supreme Court. But I think I think that. We have to. So it's not a better way. It's an alternative way.
And
but
it has worked. It
has worked. But again, we haven't had many amendments. It takes a long time to get them through, and we haven't had many in the last, say, 10 years, I think.
75 delegates, one from each House district, would be elected. They set their own agenda, debate with little public input, and decide on policy issues for the voters to change. These delegates are not held accountable like elected officials, like our senators and representatives. It is a unicameral body that would be able to make changes in many different ways. And I think, doesn't electing one delegate from each House district mean a constitutional convention will be heavily weighted toward Providence and the urban core? I mean, if people from Scituate or Tiverton or Richmond or Charleston, this is based on House districts, so there's only going to be 75, and clearly Providence, Cranston, Warwick, that urban core would have most of them.
It's well based on population, so that's where most of the population lives.
Right.
So but that's how the House is designed now. I will refute that to say that they're not accountable to the public is not necessarily true. One is that the ultimate decision would rest with the public, so the public would get to approve or reject these amendments as proposed. And to suggest that it wouldn't be an open process, it would be up to that committee, the con to decide how they're going to do it. I imagine they would conduct it like they did. Like they do House hearings, they would have pretty much committee assignments, and you'd have different bills that would be before different committees, and they would have hearings on it. And I think it would be open. I mean, it would be televised. It would have to be. This is 2024. So let's not forget the Constitutional Convention of 1789 was done in secret in Philadelphia, right? Yes. Those days are long gone. That's not going to happen. So I just think that technology is such that people expect that if a group of people are elected, to propose amendments to the fundamental governing document of Rhode Island, that those hearings will be well attended by both the public, by the press, and they'd be televised, or at least that people could watch them at online or streaming or something like that. So,
refresh my memory. Whatever the convention comes out with, excuse me, does not have to go back to the General Assembly for approval. It goes on the ballot.
It goes directly to the voters.
Okay. Now, to your point about financing, the United States Supreme Court ruled there is no limit on how much money outside interests can spend on a special interest campaign. To be sure, they would have to report it, but there's no limit on it. And so that means really one of the arguments is that out-of-state money will pour into the state to influence voters, and voters would have access to the merits of an issue through debate and not the influx, should have, rather than an influx of private money. What do you say to that?
Yes, so I mean, there's a few things, and I know we've talked a little bit about special interests and whether we think special interests would influence a constitutional convention the way that people are portraying it as, or at least we might be expecting it, based on that post-Citizens United environment. And I mean, look, I'll say it this way too, where you still see the impact of Citizens United, of dark money and special interests in the current election systems we have today. I mean, if you look at Rhode Island campaign finance records, you'll see a lot of lawmakers in the General Assembly who get donations from a bunch of lobbyist people who they can just spill cash and give it to as many representatives and senators as possible. And that's kind of how the system is. And I think when we get into that perspective, it's not something where you can say that it's going to be a big impact. But to answer your question, because I do think this is an important and valid concern, I also think there's going to be a lot of attention on this. If we were to have a constitutional convention First, we have a social media, and we have all types of outlets now that will do coverage like crazy. And on a related note to that, you will have national outlets come to the state if Rhode Island pursues this, because this will be a national feat where if this passes in November, question one, it would be the first time in around 30 or 40 years that any state has a constitutional convention. And if you want to, you can fact check me on that, but I'm pretty sure that the stats.
But you both, I think you're in agreement, as I do too, that there's a lot more transparency just due to social media and the internet than there would be in 1986. That it was a lot easier to do things secretly. So that's an important factor.
I think that's true.
Right?
And the Journal reported that some of the labor unions in the state are putting money to oppose this.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're a special interest, right? And they're putting money to oppose it. And that's their right. I respect that right. I disagree with them, but that's their right. We know it. They're going to disclose it. They said they have to disclose it, and they said they're going to put up money to oppose this.
Yes.
So to suggest that only one side money is good and the other side is not, I think it's a way to instill fear in people. I think we've gotten a lot better with campaign finance. We'll know who's giving the money, and voters will ultimately make the decision based upon the merits of the amendment. Or there's not even a guarantee that there will be amendments. That they could meet and decide everything's hunky dory with our Rhode Island Constitution. We don't want to change anything. Right. So we don't know that until the people get elected. And by the way, the unions have already come out and said that we're going to run a member in every legislative district. Yep. That's their right. I respect that. But to suggest that they're not a special interest, it's just not true. It doesn't ring true.
It's an interesting point, and it's not listed on a list of questions I wanted to discuss, but clearly a lot of candidates come in here and they're talking about, I want to be the voice of the people, and they talk about lobbying as though the unions are not they're a powerful force, and they certainly are supposed to represent their membership, who are the ordinary working people, right? And so that I just never understood that whole argument about special interest. Everybody knows that, particularly unions like the firemen and the public employees union are very, very powerful influences on Smithville. You certainly
can absolutely.
Now, the cost of convening a constitutional convention is unknown. Taxpayers will foot the bill for a con, and there are no rules as to how long it should run. Where will they meet? The temporarily elected delegates cannot meet at the State House or use any state staff. The state will have to pay to rent a venue, cater food daily, pay the delegates' expenses, and with no end in sight for the convention, they can also, it probably means that every subcommittee that breaks up to study an issue will have to hire legal counsel. So there is a real interest of what the cost would be. And in 1986, the last constitutional convention held in the country in Rhode Island cost $891,000. The House of Representatives Fiscal Office estimates that to have one now would cost taxpayers between $5 and $6 million, and that money, some people argue, should be better used to support our local cities and towns. Do you agree, Mr. Marcello?
No. So I think that to put a price on this is foolhardy. We could have, just think if the delegates in 1789 didn't want to have a convention in Philadelphia, where would we be today? I think the estimates are overblown a little bit. There's certainly no prohibition of them using the House chamber if they need to do so. They could, if it passes, the next step is for the legislature to pass legislation, organizing the election, organizing the budget, organizing where they might meet and whatnot. I do not. First of all, I think the cost is probably overblown. They will need legal counsel. There's no question about that. But think of the cost of not having one. Think how much the world has changed in the 40 years since we've had one. And to suggest that, because it's too costly, the legislature every year costs the state $33 million when I was there. I just asked someone on the way here, it's $40 million a year, every year for the General Assembly to meet. Do we say that's too much money that we should pay?
And we only meet for 6 months.
And we only meet for 6 months. So let's be honest. To suggest that this is a once in a decade proposition, And let's look at the cost of government right now. So it costs us $40 million to run the legislature now for a 6-month period. We're talking about a body that would meet for, again, the legislature could put a limit on it, say they have to put up proposals within a year or two, whatever. They meet for a year and a half at most. It'll be over. Voters will get to vote on it. There's, of course, a cost of a special election to elect these people, but we have elections anyway to elect General Assembly members. Do we say, oh, we shouldn't have elections because they're costly? That's just not how democracy works in America.
Right.
And I just think that's another scare tactic that's out there. Think of the cost of not having one. This is an opportunity for everyday people, for the public of the state of Rhode Island, not to get involved in what their government should look like for the next 10 years, 40 years, what the structure of government needs to look like. And I think it's money well spent.
And some of those, let's be honest, some of those delegates will be presumably working folks, let's say.
I would hope so, yeah.
Yeah, so they're going to have to meet so that it doesn't interfere with people's regular jobs.
Just like the General Assembly does today.
Except the General Assembly today is, the majority of people are like municipal employees, teachers, lawyers. I mean, there are certain professions, let us say, that dominate the
professions that have more flexibility in their schedules. Absolutely, that's true.
Yeah.
And that is true. But the beauty of the convention is the convention will decide where they're going to meet, how often they're going to meet, and where they're going to meet.
Yeah.
But the goal is to get everyday people in it, to not have the politicians,
Exactly.
to have a say in what goes on, because ultimately everything will be voted upon by the people.
Yep. Let's take a couple of specific examples. Article 1, Section 22 of the Rhode Island Constitution says, and I quote, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed," period. There's no militia language in our Constitution. And for the last several years, this right has been infringed by individual pieces of legislation that have been put forward by special interest groups. For example, the Moms Demand Action is funded by one of the richest men in the world, Michael Bloomberg. The Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence has several sources of funding, one of which is the Hassenfeld Foundation, which is set up by the heirs to the maker of G.I. Joe toys, and that's Hasbro, all in the name of public safety. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court has handed down a number of cases ruling that the right to own and carry a firearm is an individual right. I ask each of you to respond. Is this, our Constitution right now is fairly broad, and yet it's being modified gradually over the last few sessions. Is this an area which will be vulnerable to constitutional convention, Mr. Salzillo?
Yes, I appreciate being able to answer the question. I mean, in regards to whether it's firearms or even other hot-button issues that we're talking about today, a lot of hot-button cultural issues.
Let's just focus on this one, because I
got
others.
Right. I do want to stay focused on that, absolutely. I actually don't think so. And I guess what I want to say by that is, what is the focus of a constitutional convention, of this potential CONCON? And a lot of it's about clean government, good government reforms. And so we mentioned, I mean, just to use Rep. Marcello's words about what are the costs of not having a convention. So let's think of an inspector general, which is...
We'll get to those.
All right, sounds good.
Just stick to the point that we're talking.
But to answer your question, I don't think that there'll be too many concerns about that.
So even if there was an amendment, the Second Amendment in the Iran Constitution was still subject to the federal Constitution, Second Amendment. So it can't be any less restrictive than that. So I think that's, could it be discussed? Yes. I have never seen gun issues even when I was in the legislature. There's certainly a hot button topic, but I don't see it. We're still subject to the federal government, the federal Constitution. So I think there's plenty of protections there as well.
Okay. Now let's talk about what you just started to talk about, Inspector General. That's one of the things that I think proponents say, well, they've had meetings and the public has been allowed to provide input before this whole question was formulated. Inspector General is one very interesting topic, and I wonder if one of you, and I'll ask each of you, how would you envision an Inspector General's office being established in the state of Rhode Island?
Well, again, this is an example of something that's been there where I was served in the legislature for 8 years, and that bill, as a constitutional amendment, was put up is put up almost every year that I was there. It went nowhere. So this is an issue that obviously has some interest for some elements in society, but gets stalled at the General Assembly for whatever reason, right? Either special interest or they just don't think it's necessary. The politicians that are there don't think it's necessary. So this is to go to the structure of government. This is where a constitutional convention can be very helpful in that voters could amend the structure of government by establishing an article, probably within the article where the General Assembly is set up, or a separate article itself, establishing an independent inspector general, listing the powers and duties of that office, what they can look into and whatnot. And that will be the structure. That will be something in the Constitution that couldn't be amended by the legislature at all, unless through another constitutional convention or another constitutional amendment. And then it would have to be funded by the General Assembly. And there you have it, right? So there's a perfect example, and there are pros and cons on either side. There's a perfect example of a structural reform that hasn't made it through the General Assembly. That's been a hot topic for the 8 years that I was there. It's been probably there for 20 years. But it's very simple. If the voters want it, they put it in the Constitution, they vote for it, and it's there, just like the Ethics Commission in 1986. The 1986 Ethics Commission came out when we had all the scandals with the courts, all the different scandals with the judges and the going back and forth and the appointments, and the voters said, we've had enough. We're going to establish an independent Ethics Commission that's going to oversee everybody, an elected and appointed official, and we did. That's a perfect example of something that could be done that affects the structure of government.
I assume that you're in favor. I guess my question is, how would it work? We've had, we've had several candidates for office this year come on and support this idea, but when I say to them, how would it work? Nobody seems to be able to tell me how exactly an inspector general would work. I think people have this idea that this would be some sort of a super agency that would be able to go anywhere in the government and snoop around and find waste. In fact, one of them was talking about they would be able to anticipate something like the bridge problem we're all having, which is absolutely ridiculous. But how would you see it working?
So let me just say, in response to Rep. Marcello, because he has the expertise on this issue, that he made a pretty good blueprint of what an Inspector General office would be like and how that would work. As in, I mean, I don't want to say legislation, but as into the specifics of establishing such an office. But to answer your question, I mean, there's one thing that does come to mind as a specific, which is, and this is actually to borrow from another state lawmaker who I know, which is determine whether the Inspector General is in the purview of the Speaker or in the purview of the General Assembly leadership and just the State House political establishment overall, or to have it be independent, which is what they have in Minnesota. They have it as an Auditor General in Minnesota, which is a nonpartisan, independent office. So that's the first part. What is the office like? The second part is, what would the Inspector General do, which is very important. And I think it's especially important because there are a lot of things going on in the state right now where if you had, say, more oversight, more accountability, we wouldn't be really talking about this. The Inspector General proposal is something that, I don't know if the numbers are right, but I think it's around 73% approval for an Inspector General's office to be established. And I think that kind of tells you about the distrust in government and the concerns about government more accurately, with instances like, as Rep. Marcello knows, about 38 studios and what happened with the distrust and the distrust there, all the things that occurred behind closed doors that a lot of people didn't know about outside of a few particular notable political individuals, as well as, say, Eleanor Slater Hospital or Providence Public Schools, which I take heart into because of public records access. But to go upon that point of how an Inspector General office could work, that's at least a little outline of how it could work.
Let me just jump into that for a second. It's a clean slate, right? So Inspector General could be appointed by the governor. It could be appointed by a joint committee of the legislature. It could be elected by the people. You just have to put the language in the Constitution of how you want to do it. So,
right.
You know, the most independent Inspector General would probably be someone that's elected directly by the people. And you'd lay out the powers of the office. The Inspector General shall have the power to do X, Y, and Z, have the power to, audit any department or whatever. Again, whether you're in favor or against it, but those kind of questions, the broad framework would be put in there. The independence would be determined upon, if it's elected, appointed, whatnot. But those are all questions that the Constitutional Convention could grapple with and find out what is the best way way, but is it the Minnesota model? Is it another model out there? But those are all good questions. But in order to get to the Inspector General, you have to establish the broad framework, put it in the Constitution, and then it's untouchable. And then, to the extent there needs to be gaps filled in, how much staff, what their budget, then the legislature would have to do that, just like we do with the governor's office or any other office.
If it's a creature of the legislature, we already have an auditor general. It's a creature of the legislature. And we had on this program a former very competent auditor general named Ernie Almonte, who argued that you don't need an inspector general on top of the auditor general's office. And several years back, we had a former auditor general who was going into private business, and he actually developed a bill, outlining how the office would work. And when it was presented to the Speaker of the House at the time, not the current one, I don't want to necessarily mention any names, but I actually met with him to talk about it. And the objection was, well, the legislature would give up too much control over this. That's why it probably never really went anywhere. This bill even described the method of funding the office. That would not be like a tax on the public or come out of the state budget. But anyway, it's an interesting concept. I think a lot of people misunderstand it. And one of the other things about having a general vote is that my concern would be the person running for Attorney General is generally considered to have to be a member of the bar. We have general officers like the treasurer, where even the current one has no financial background. So, well, there'd have to be specificity about who could qualify as a candidate, which then creates another constitutional question if it's a general vote. That would be just points that I would like to make out. But I'd like to talk about, how about the governor and lieutenant governor, instead of running as separate general officers, running together? So you avoid the issue of two different parties being represented, which we had at one point, and then,
I agree with that 100%. That was a bill that was in the General Assembly again for many years. I think that the problems that we face government right now are so overwhelming, and the issues are so complex that you need a team approach. Yep. And it's nice to have a governor and a lieutenant governor who are elected together, so there's a trust there. They're running on the same ticket, that you can delegate some of the powers, some of the issues to a lieutenant governor, so they could work on specific issues. When you have a split office right now, I was there when it was Kachiri, and I think it was the current governor. Yeah, it was Roberts. Excuse me.
Roberts.
And she didn't really have much to do.
Well, the same thing happened with Gina Raimondo and McKee.
Well, they were the same party, but exactly.
But even then, yeah.
Right. But I guess there was a personality issue, but I don't know what it was.
If there was a personality issue, they probably wouldn't run together.
Right.
The party would probably say these two candidates are too dissimilar.
Right. I just think that that's a reform that I think his time has come. I think government needs a team approach. It would be nice to have those two people working together. This idea that the lieutenant governor is somehow checking the governor, it doesn't work. It's not true. No.
And I think you remember when we had Bruce Sunland and there was a Republican lieutenant governor. But I think you remember.
Jack Voney.
Jack Voney, yeah. Yes. And we had that storm, and the governor was out of the state, and so Lieutenant Governor Jack, when Sunland came back, suddenly the legislature said, well, no, that's not going to happen because he acts as the president of the Senate, which is no longer the case. Right. The president of the Senate is the president of the Senate.
Let me suggest why that reform never gets through, because that legislature is full, and this is not criticism of my fellow colleagues. In that legislature, the General Assembly, a good majority of people think that someday I could run for lieutenant governor.
Yes.
And I'm going to do it independently of the governor. So they want to hold that office so they can independently run for it. And that's why you'll never see the legislature pass that kind of reform. Yeah. But I think if the people had the opportunity to do so in a con, they probably would bypass the legislature, the special interests that are there, and probably come in conformance with the majority, I think, the states that allow them to run together as a team.
Was it the 1986 convention that established 4-year terms for the general officers and 2 terms?
It was rejected, actually. The 4-year terms was rejected. It was put in later when they reformed the General Assembly went from 100 to 75 members and from 50 to 38.
How did that? I'm trying to remember. How did that revision take place?
That was through the legislature.
Right.
Yeah.
So again,
after the census,
here's a case where a convention recommended something, the voters rejected, but then the legislature went back, and it passed, obviously.
But there was a reduction in the number of the people in the legislatures,
Yes,
and that was the big, and there was a raising of the pay of members of the legislature, and so it was kind of like a trade-off a little bit. So.
Well, everything's a trade-off,
Absolutely,
right?
yeah. There's nothing wrong with trade-off.
Politics
It's
work.
compromise. That's all it is.
And it's definitely an interesting question about whether we should have the governor, lieutenant governor run as a ticket like it's done in a lot of states, including Minnesota, Wisconsin.
How about including the federal government?
That too. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
even that, but you have it in a lot of other places. We're one of the few states that individually elect a governor, lieutenant governor differently. But I also think, just to make this point quickly, this also speaks to a lot of the issues that would be discussed, because we're talking a lot about procedural issues, about good government, clean government issues. And that's why the CONCOM proposal is gaining a lot of bipartisan support, not just from myself or from Rep. Marcello, but also from Steve Frias, the GOP committeeman, national GOP committeeman. The Vincent Marcello, he's an independent. There's also Ray Rickman, a civil rights advocate. And I know there's a lot of talk about how this could be a bad thing for civil rights and other liberties. He's on board with it, which is actually quite fascinating thing to see, and it's a pretty good sign that you have that kind of support.
At the end of the day, it's a review. It's a review of the current Constitution. Is it serving the needs of the people in 2024? That's the question. And it's not bad to have a review every so often. Most cities and towns who have home rule charters, which are 38 of them, they mandate a review of their local government through different methods, whether it's a charter commission every 10 years, or they elected a charter commission. But there's a mandated period of review, and they do it, and they review their local government. We have not reviewed our state government structure since 1984 or 1986.
The town I live in has a charter provision that you have to review the entire town charter every 10 years. Yeah. But the council can call for this commission to meet to study specific sections. And at one point I chaired that committee, and I have to tell you that the problem with that one, which is not going to happen with this proposal, is that anything that commission proposed had to be approved by the town council, which kind of defeats the purpose. That's why I asked you earlier, would a CONCON's proposals have to go through the legislature?
Well, that provision that you talk about for local charters is basically in the Rhode Island Constitution, but it says that, so that could be changed. That's one of the things that we haven't really talked about, the Home Rule Amendment, on how that could be amended to give cities and towns more power over certain issues.
Yes.
We haven't even touched that yet, but that's just one. But again, you review the whole document, doesn't necessarily going to change things wholesale. You might review some rights and responsibilities, you might not. But again, since 1984, we haven't had a thorough review of our government. Think in 1984, there was no internet. There was no thing as Facebook.
Sure.
Technology has transformed the way government operates, the way that people interact with the government, and we just have to figure out whether the current structure is receptive to our needs as modern-day citizens in 2024. Should not be fair to do so.
We have about a little less than 15 minutes. So I just want to go through some other things that came to mind as I was preparing for the show. We are obviously a very small state with maybe 1.1 million people, plus or take 100,000. Do we really need a bicameral legislature? I mean, you look at cities, there's cities that have 3 and 4 or 5 times our population, and they don't have 2 chambers. The only answer I've ever gotten when I've asked legislators is that, well, we're part-time, and what one house misses, the other one might catch. But what about a unicameral legislature that meets, say, 9 or 10 months a year and is paid decently, so that only people that are ordinary folks could also run?
I think it's a fair question. I think there's only one state, Nebraska, that has a unicameral legislature, and it was put in the Depression when money was short. Having served in the legislature, I see the benefit of a 2-house system, a bicameral legislature, because it's not what one house misses, the other catches up. They do represent different constituencies. The Senate is much larger.
The Senate's districts are larger, so there's fewer senators.
Fewer senators, the districts are larger, yes. there's a good check and balance there. Sometimes, sometimes the House would send something over the Senate that's really not, good for the state or whatever, and the Senate kills it, vice versa. So I support the bicameral system. But again, a CONCON would only review it, and we could have these kind of debates, and that's all this would be. And if they decide they want to try it, then it would still be subject to the voter approval. But there's nothing wrong with having the time and the energy to review it. Does a bicameral legislature make sense in 2024? I think yes, but my colleagues or people who get elected might think differently. But again, what would the voters eventually say? But I don't have a problem with the bicameral system. Quick question about whether the legislature should go full-time and be reduced even further. That's another interesting issue that could be discussed. But again, it's all part of the review.
Yeah, it's always struck me as somewhat incongruous that both houses go for 2 years and they're both elected at the same time. Yeah. It just seems to me, I once asked someone, I think it was a lawyer, why, and they said the Supreme Court ruled that the Senate has to be based on population, and so the Senate districts are larger, but there's fewer of them. But I never understood exactly that logic of a 2-year term that everybody's get reelected.
They could have staggered terms.
I mean, the Senate could go 4 years.
Right, the Senate could go 4 years and have a staggered term like the U.S. Senate, which is 6-year terms. But that's a reform that could be discussed.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting question, and there's a lot of questions like that about how should state government be structured in that sense. Now, I think the full-time legislature question is one that it would animate a lot of debate. That's one I'm very interested in as to whether, and that might also help with, even with the appearance of a conflict of interest. It makes things simpler, and you pay lawmakers the amount of money that, and the dignity too with it. So I think, a full-time legislature, that's one model. Another one was, like as Rep. Marcello was saying, because some states do this, like Iowa and Pennsylvania and South Carolina and New Mexico, which is they do have some staggered terms for state senators, which is kind of similar to how the Senate is structured in that sense. So there are some good questions about how that could be structured, and that's just more of talking about how procedural, these are procedural questions that are really being discussed, ways to make government better, to reform government, and that's just one aspect of it. Also, there's redistricting, but just to answer that specific question.
In terms of redistricting, one of the other things that popped into my head was this. I mean, we're such a small state. We really forget how small we are. But if you look at the map and you flip Rhode Island over, we only cover the two easternmost counties of Connecticut, which itself is not a very large state. We have 39 municipalities. A lot of states have county governments. What do you think about a consolidation into a county government type situation in Rhode Island?
Well, right now the county is really basically the administrative framework for the court system. That's what we use counties for. And really, we've combined counties for the court system. Again, that's another issue that could be reviewed. Do I think that would pass? Probably not. I think that's probably too radical. But I think that there are a lot of other structural issues that can be looked at before we look at the county government. However, there could be a constitutional amendment that mandates that the legislature within 5 years, 10 years, report back on maybe consolidating the school districts. Right?
Yes,
right?
That was my next question.
So that could be something that you could put in the Constitution, say that the General Assembly has 5 years to report back or decide whether or not we're going to consolidate school districts. Yep. That's the type of thing that this CONCON could look at, and that's why. I think that's why I support it, because it opens up not only the rights and responsibilities, but the structure. I'm more interested in the structure of government. I'm more interested in how our government runs today as to what it's going to look like for the next 40 years. And I just don't think that by ignoring this opportunity to give the people their absolute right, it's their right, this is their government, right? This is, and I just believe that this is an opportunity for them to step up and say that we want to take a look at this, and we want a fresh look, and I hope they do support it.
Yeah. If you travel to other states, people are kind of amazed. I mean, for example, we have 38 municipal police departments. We have a Capitol Police, we have environmental police, we have airport police, we have a sheriff's department, which is largely responsible for transporting prisoners and so forth. I mean, there's obviously administrative overhead in all of these, but do we really need that? I mean, in a lot of states, a sheriff is elected by county, who's the chief law enforcement officer. And, you know, maybe cities like Providence and Warwick, Cranston would need separate ones. Like Los Angeles has a separate LAPD, but the sheriff in LA County is for the whole county. Do you think that would be something that would make sense or would even be considered?
I personally wouldn't know much about it. I think it would be hard. I think even though we complain an awful lot about having these 38 cities and towns, I think Rhode Islanders respect and want their 39 cities and towns, and they want their individual police chiefs and whatnot. So to me, that's not a reform that would be top of my agenda. But again, it could be looked at, and maybe the convention people decide, well, we'll look at it, but we're not going to go that way. But again, it's an opportunity to look at those type of issues. But I'm more interested in the general structure of the government that we have now.
Well, that would be a structural kind of thing too.
Somewhat, but it's kind of like sheriffs. We're kind of like, you know, we're kind of into the weeds.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, we're into the weeds.
But I mean, that's, as you say, there's nothing that would prevent a convention from discussing it, which then gets back to the issue. If it's really a part-time job for a lot of these delegates, hopefully they're not all people that aren't retired or have a profession that allows them flexibility, we would hope that they would discuss it, which each of these things would take time. That's my point. As you said, they may come back a year and a half from now, or maybe even longer, because there's no limit on what they can come up with, which again goes back to the issue of is $5 or $6 million excessive? Well, if you take 10% of what it costs to run the state budget, you're still talking between $4 and $5 million, right?
Right.
So are there any areas that we haven't discussed that you think would be of interest to the Constitutional Convention or should be addressed by one?
One takeaway that I was actually thinking of is about the Citizens Initiative. So just to give a little example on it, because there's a lot of conversation about how the soccer stadium, whether that should be approved with taxpayer money, whether voters should approve that. And I think that's one instance of something that people could really look at, whether they want to have a say in those type of, whether you call them deals or processes, whether they have a say in that. And it's something that I'm very intrigued into because of our experience with what happened with a lot of the controversy about Tidewater Soccer Stadium, which was a major political issue, campaign issue, but it wasn't something that voters directly decide on. And there's a lot of questions about whether that was something that should be relegated just to a particular government board. I think it's like the Commerce Corporation or one of the board seats. But I think it's something that you can definitely look at, having more of a say, which is also opening up the process, having it be more transparent, which is something that a lot of people talk about, whether it's public records or, in this instance, the use of taxpayer money.
So the commission that was established by the legislature issued a report. You can find this online. And it's the Bipartisan Preparatory Commission for the Constitutional Convention. And they outlined some of the things that came up when they took testimony. And I think this is just a good roadmap of things that could be looked at that we haven't really talked about. Elections and voting, same-day voter registration, ranked choice voting, citizen ballot initiatives, nonpartisan primaries, term limits for elected officials, government structure. They talked about line item veto, removal of lifetime tenure for Supreme Court justices, legislative veto of agency rulemaking, establishment of an Office of Inspector General, which we talked about. Something that I'm interested in, expansion of public access to government records.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
We have what's so-called APRA,
APRA,
which is a way for public to request this information. And as we all know, sometimes that is thwarted by the agency or the or the town that is trying to hold it back by saying, "Well, you have to pay us so much money." They even do it to news agencies, as you know. So, how would what you're talking about? Do you have any idea how?
Yeah, so you could put something in the Constitution. I envision broad language, basically saying that government records belong to the public, and the public's right to inspect and obtain those records shall not be, unreasonably stopped or, unreasonably withheld. And you put a broad principle like that, and then the mechanism of how it gets implemented would probably be left to some more legislation. But when you put it in the Constitution, the people have spoken directly. They have amended their Constitution to say this is our government, and we believe that records should be public and they should be accessible. And then you start from that principle, and that broad principle should trickle down to more access to government. But it could be, I think Florida has what is considered the model of open records, and it's in their Constitution, so that's something that I think could be looked at. But I don't know the specifics of Florida. But that's how you put that broad principle in that Constitution.
Sure. And those who would oppose it would say, yeah, but we have these gadflies that are come around. They ask us for 10,000 pages.
Yeah,
that's counter. But again, this is the debate that should take place within the context of a convention.
If I have to say there was one issue that really put it in the forefront of what a con-con, what the potential of the con-con could be, it would be the issue of the public records, which is something that Rep. Marcello knows a lot about from his experience in State House politics. And I think there's just a few ways I look at it. One is a lot has changed since 1986, the last time we had a con-con, which is we have emails, we have the internet. So there's a lot of stuff that may not be covered the same way that it used to be back in the old days. And I don't know if I'm just trying to remember this, but for instance, there was something about, I guess it was the pension system in Providence, whether it was a Category 5 hurricane, and we didn't really know the full scope of it, in part because there was emails that weren't technically covered in public records at the time. And so those are some of the questions you have to sort out with new technology, and I think that's one part of it. The other is there has to be more teeth on state public records laws today, and I'll just mention it as a personal experience. Myself and my older brother, who attended Providence Public Schools, we wanted to get some records, so we filed requests on the fate of Mount Pleasant High School, because no one really knew what was going on. In fact, the only reason the neighborhood found out was because the state senator and the state rep were telling us effectively that the education officials, the state education officials in Fontaine Green, the education commissioner, the superintendent, were considering closing it down or maybe demolishing it or turning it into a charter school. And just from that experience, because we did file a request, we were blown off. Then we filed a complaint with the attorney.
Who's the we? When you say we filed them?
My brother.
Oh, okay.
My brother and I. We filed a request with Providence Public Schools, never answered. Yeah. We filed a complaint with the Attorney General, which we haven't really heard back. Not to say that it didn't go anywhere necessarily, but we haven't heard back on it. And this was something you would expect the General Assembly to have some oversight on, but there's no oversight on this specific issue, especially with Providence Public Schools more broadly speaking. And in the context of that, that's really one real area that we can really confront and needs to be confronted, which is access to public records and whether reporters should be fined for trying to get access to records that are in the interest of we the people.
Of course, what happens we have the Federal Freedom of Information Act, and very often lawsuits are brought to gain that information, and what the agencies do is say, yeah, we're going to give you a redacted report.
That too.
So what you see, I was just watching, I forget what the report was, but they got all blank pages.
Yep.
With just a heading on the page and the page number, and they said, well, we had to redact all
So
that.
if you have a constitutional provision, a broad statement, like you said, the Second Amendment is a broad statement, right? In our Constitution, you have a broad amendment that basically says that public records, government records are public records, and the public has a right to get them. Then that's a broad principle that then the courts would have to interpret it, and it would have a little bit more teeth because it's in the Constitution. Unlike what it's now, it's a legislative act that can be amended.
Yeah. There's one thing that popped into my mind was the reinstating the death penalty for certain crimes like mass murder and terrorist attack. We eliminated the death penalty in Rhode Island for very good reason, because we found innocent people were suffering. And frankly, I have concerns about that, but there are maybe certain crimes that are so heinous that we need that. Do you think that would be something would be?
I personally think that the death penalty debate in Rhode Island is long over. Yeah. It's been over since 1840. So, again, Con could look into that. I don't think that would get much traction. But it depends upon who gets elected, I guess. And that's, again, it's a review. So.
And I agree with that sentiment too, just in the sense that the debate is kind of long overdue, in that I think we were one of the first states in the country, if not the first state in the country, to abolish the death penalty. And a lot of that's still relevant today in how there are innocent people who are being on death row, on being at execution. There was a man in Missouri recently. So it's not to say that it won't happen. I mean, there's a lot of things that can open up and we can have a discussion, but I just don't see the public really changing on that as to say.
There is certainly, we're all aware of cases where the death penalty has been inflicted, and then DNA evidence shows that it wasn't warranted,
Right.
It wasn't that guy. So that's why I have reservations about it, but I just feel that maybe that it would act as a deterrent for some crimes. Probably not, but I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
I'm just looking for.
Again, it's a little bit beyond the structure of a government, but it certainly could be looked at. But I don't think the CONCON would get. I think that debate in Rhode Island is pretty much over.
Sure, and the Supreme Court could always come back and
Right.
say, no, we've kind of ruled on this before,
Right.
so yeah. Well, I appreciate the fact that both of you came on, and I thank both of you for being here. And actually, we hope that voters will find this discussion informative. The voting season starts on October 16th in Rhode Island, and early voting is available at all town halls or certain places in the town. The election day is November 5th, and all mail-in ballots must be in by 4 p.m. that day, even though the polls are open to 8. So we urge you, all three of us certainly do, and everybody on State of the State, urge you to exercise this right and privilege of voting. And would either of you like to take a minute and summarize what we've been
Well,
talking
I'm going to go to the founding document, if I could. I brought
Sure.
this today. So, and one of the Declaration of Independence, basically, I'm going to read it directly from it because I can't paraphrase it. It says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That's Thomas Jefferson in 1776. This all CONCON is doing is putting that principle into place, allowing the people to look at the form of government to see if it's serving their just ends and is it securing their happiness and safety in 2024. So having a CONCON is older than the current Constitution. It goes back to 1776. And all CONCON would be doing is giving the people their right to exercise their sovereignty to determine whether or not the form of government which we serve under is serving their needs. And that's all it is. And all this other stuff, to me, is irrelevant.
So I suppose we could refer to you as a younger voter? What's the viewpoint of the young voter?
Well, also, I'll just say that this is my first presidential election I'll be voting for, too, so I'm a very young voter. Not bragging. I'm not trying to...
No, that's fine.
not trying to flatter.
Wish we could brag. We can't brag.
But if I could say something as to a last word on what CONCON is about, and look, I understand that there are some stuff going around about what could happen potentially in a CONCON. I mean, look at all the issues that are being outlined. Think of what you might be concerned about. Think of what might help you, and that's kind of the way I thought of it. Do the benefits outweigh the potential negatives? And in my mind, in my personal opinion, a lot of it is a lot of benefits and a lot of opportunities that can come from it. Inspector General. Just having a conversation about it here, public records reform and toughening the laws there, taxpayer approval for certain bonds. I mean, there's a lot of things that we could talk about, even redistricting. So in that sense, I hope people do take the time, sure, evaluate both cases, make your best informed decision on it. I'll just say, do consider it, and we're happy to answer any questions on CONCON if needed.
Now, I guess the final question I have is, and this is probably a yes or no, are either of you considering running as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention?
I haven't thought of it, to be honest. I mean, it's something that, it could be on my mind. It would have to depend on my academic schedule, but I could be open to it, but right now I'm just going to say undecided.
I certainly would consider it if the voters approve it, but we have to get that first step. I would consider it.
Is this going to be a nonpartisan kind of election for delegates?
Well, it's up to the legislature.
Yeah, okay.
It's up for them to decide how they structure it. But the last one was nonpartisan, 1986.
Okay. Well, once again, I want to thank our guests, and I want to thank our audience for watching State of the State. We hope you'll join us for a future edition of this program. Thank you very much.